Okay, continuing on with part 2 of the lesson on forces of evolution, we were defining some terms and then talking about two different kinds or two different scales of evolution, microevolution and macroevolution. So the way we've been defining biological evolution so far is a change in gene frequency over a few generations or over time. That is basically the definition of a microevolution, except we distinguish by saying a few generations. We usually say, when we define evolution, a change in gene frequencies in a population over time. This is over a few generations. And the example is shown here in this image of the green and brown beetles and how they've changed over generations. So this can even happen over one generation. So microevolution can happen on a small scale in a small period of time. There's a misconception that we need a lot of time to observe evolution, and that's not true. We can see it in one generation. And again, macroevolution is the same thing happening just over longer periods of time. Those changes accumulate and we get what you call speciation here over a long period of time. So as I said, the same changes in gene frequencies but stretched out over a much longer period of time can explain how horse ancestors have gotten larger and have reduced their digits from 5 toes to 3 toes to 1 toe over time. We might call these individual horse fossils that were represented in this slide before as different species, though the same natural selection pressures that help explain change in gene frequencies in beetles also can explain macroevolutionary changes like horse evolution. The only difference is the time scale over which these processes are operating. So again, with microevolution and macroevolution, genes are the records through which these short or long-term changes are constructed. Geneticists strive to document genetic change and explain why it occurs. For example, if a trait in a population increases from 60% frequency to 65% frequency over generations, geneticists can look into why. There are just as interesting instances where gene frequencies do not change over time, when the frequencies of a population's alleles for a particular trait are in a state of equilibrium. So here we are now moving on to forces of evolution. Reviewing again, because it's very important, and I've said this a lot this semester, biological evolution is defined as a change in gene frequencies in a population over time. A gene frequency is a proportional representation of a phenotype in a population. For example, 6 brown-eyed people out of 10. The frequency of brown eyes is 0.6. Okay, so gene frequency is just a number representing proportions of genes in a population. Again, evolution is a change in gene frequency in a population over time. So we have at least 4 identified causes or forces of evolution. Again, these are called many different things: the mechanisms of evolution, factors of evolution, forces, and causes. Nevertheless, it's important to remember there are 4 main ones: mutation, gene flow, genetic drift, and natural selection. Sometimes, depending on who you're talking to or what textbook we're using in this class, meiosis or recombination and crossing over is considered a 5th force, which is one reason I wanted you all to remember that for your recent assignment on meiosis. So keep that into consideration as well when we're talking about forces of evolution. Okay, mutations. We hear this word a lot. We've heard of mutations, but what are they actually? This part of the lesson could also go in our basics of genetics, but it is a force of evolution as well, so let's talk about it. Mutation is a random change in a gene. A mutation can change genes, add genes, or remove genes. They can be harmful, beneficial, or neutral. Mutations are very important because they're the source of new genetic variation, as well as the raw material of evolution. Mutations change gene frequencies in populations, which is why they're a force of evolution. This is definitely one thing that will change those precious gene frequencies we're always paying attention to. So they cause evolution by changing the genes. This picture illustrates a single gene mutation responsible for most cases of hereditary hemochromatosis. So one gene mutation, one letter change in the genome, can change or create a cause a disease even. So sometimes just one tiny change can make a big difference. As I said earlier, mutations can be beneficial, harmful, or neutral. Remember, much of our genome is non-coding. It's kind of like junk, or it doesn't do anything that we know of. So the mutations that happen in these parts of our genes can act neutral, or even just act as markers, just neutral genetic baggage that we can use to trace relationships sometimes. So many mutations don't affect an individual's health, well-being, or survival. And mutations are happening with every generation. So keep that in mind as well. Mutations include deletions, insertions, and duplications of letters in a DNA sequence. These can affect just one letter in the sequence or involve large segments of DNA or even chromosomes. Mutations happen continuously, thus all species continue to evolve, and geneticists can calculate rates at which various types of mutations appear. Certain factors, environmental factors like radiation, may increase the rate at which mutations occur. One important thing to remember about mutations is that they occur randomly. They don't occur out of need. We just get what we're stuck with when mutations happen. You might remember Lamarck. He said that the giraffe's necks change out of some inner need. Well, we don't have any inner need creating mutations. They are random. And natural selection just has to do what it does with mutations by either selecting them out or selecting for them if they are beneficial. So natural selection can work in either direction, negatively or positively, on the raw material that is provided by mutations. There are different types of mutations. Mutations involving incorrect base pairs are called point mutations. Sometimes this leads to the same amino acid being produced, and sometimes the amino acid is different. So don't forget, those letters are coding for amino acids, which are then chained together to form proteins. One example, a mutation on human chromosome 11 results in a GUG codon instead of a GAG codon. The GUG codon is encoded to produce this amino acid valine instead of the normal glutamic acid. This one letter substitution leads to the abnormal hemoglobin that results in sickle cell anemia, which is what we were talking about earlier, and we'll come back to that. So remember, the sickle cell trait is due to a mutation, and it's just one letter resulting in a different amino acid, and that leads to this disease of sickle cell anemia. Transposable elements are genes that can copy themselves into entirely different places along the DNA sequence. So large parts of DNA sequences or entire chromosomes can be affected by mutations. An entire piece of chromosome can be moved to another chromosome, can be replaced differently on the same chromosome, or can be positioned backwards in a chromosome. So these crazy mutations in DNA sequences can just do basically whatever they want and get all mixed up with mutations. Mutations can either be spontaneous with no known cause or induced, caused by a specific agent such as a mutagen, like radiation or human activity. But most mutations are spontaneous. The mutation rate among humans is 1 per million per nucleotide per generation. Since we have around 3 billion base pairs, this results in around 0.5 mutation per person per generation, or one whole potentially significant mutation in every other person born. So remember, we're all mutants. We've all carried these mutations. Some have been kept, some have been weeded out, and some of them don't do anything. So we all have mutations, and they happen with every generation. For individuals, most mutations are relatively harmless, while few may have profound consequences, like we discussed earlier. For populations, mutations are inconsequential unless they offer selective adaptive advantages. Remember that mutation is the only source of new genetic material or new alleles. Okay, moving on. There will be a few more slides in this part of the video about natural selection, and then we'll move on to part 3. This is going to be a partial review of natural selection, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth and talk about different patterns of natural selection. I mentioned earlier that natural selection can do different things, and we will discuss that a little bit here and in the next part of the lesson. So, once new genetic variants are introduced into the population, the mutations we talked about, natural selection can go to work. Don't forget, natural selection is a difference between the fitness of individuals with certain phenotypes compared with individuals of other phenotypes. Remember that fitness is the ability of an individual organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. Don't forget the importance of reproduction. We ought to talk about life and death when we're talking about nature and evolution. It doesn't really matter as far as evolution goes if you live. It only matters if you reproduce. If you're alive and you do not reproduce, evolution has ended with you. Your genes are not going to be passed on to the generation. So just think about it like this. Your DNA sticks around to pass itself on to the next generation. If it doesn't, it fails basically. So I want you guys to keep that in mind as you're listening to these lessons on evolution, that not only do you need to survive, there's a myth out there that Darwin said evolution was survival of the fittest. That's not his quote. It's or not just survival, but fitness, the ability of an individual organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. Another definition of natural selection is individuals who have biological characteristics best suited to a particular environment survive and reproduce with greater frequency than individuals without those characteristics. So here we are, last slide of this portion of the lesson. Just to review natural selection, there are 4 conditions which must be met for natural selection to occur. There must be differences in individuals' traits. These traits must be heritable by the next generation. Fitness also varies among individuals, and fitness depends on these traits. When these conditions are present, individuals with greater fitness will survive, reproduce, and pass on these traits more often than individuals with less fitness. Therefore, the next generation will have greater frequencies of the traits, which allow for greater fitness. Okay, this is the end of part 2. Please move on to part 3 of this lesson.